Welcome to No2Nato. This would ordinarily be a routine broadcast by No2Nato, No to War, but this is an emergency. Here is the news. In the year of our Lord 2024, in the month of November, the United States of America and the United Kingdom, led respectively by the senile Joe Biden and the wooden-headed Keir Starmer, fired cruise missiles into Russia in defiance of red lines which had been set all too clearly by the president of Russia only a couple of weeks before, in which he said, if any of these long-range missiles, ATACMS, HIMARS, Storm Shadows, with substantial ranges of up to 200 miles are fired into Russian territory, we will regard that as an act of war, and we will consider the NATO powers responsible for the action and will act accordingly. President Putin went on to say, we would regard these acts of war as coming not from Ukraine, but from NATO itself and the whole alliance at that, not only the members of NATO whose missiles they were. Therefore, in the month of November, egregious acts of war, knowing the consequences, were committed by the United States government, as is presently constituted, though not long for this world, and more seriously, the United Kingdom government. I'll explain what I mean by more seriously in just a minute. It's transparent, the motive of President Biden or whoever is working him from behind. Not many people believe that he is sentient enough to be making serious decisions about war and peace, particularly a war that could very easily escalate to becoming a nuclear war. It's transparent that the motive was to scupper, to hold below the waterline, the incoming battleship of Donald J. Trump, who becomes president of the United States on the 20th of January, having won a landslide victory on an open and repeated promise to bring the war in Ukraine to an end and to stop the endless supply of money and weapons from the United States to the Kiev regime. This election platform, this flagship election policy, is, of course, diametrically in contradiction with what Joe Biden has now done. He is clearly seeking to make stopping the war on the 20th of January impossible. It's one final act of criminality from a criminal president, Joe Biden, who's been committing crimes against the peoples of the world for 50 years in Washington. But the consequences for the United Kingdom are, in my view, very much more serious. I'll come to them in just a minute. So, Russia said that it would respond, and it did. It responded with a message so chilling that it's a wonder not every news bulletin is currently leading with it, but they're not. The message delivered by Moscow overnight was precisely the kind of multi-warheaded craft, intercontinental ballistic missiles, albeit modified to an intermediate range, which showed exactly what will happen if the Russians make war on us in response to us making war on them. From a British point of view, I happen to know there are 3 of those missiles with our name on it. In the Kaliningrad base, underground, they would be fired at the United Kingdom and would arrive in just under 13 minutes' time. They are, as you just saw on the screen, absolutely unstoppable. They are flying at Mach 10. They cannot be intercepted by any other craft known to man. They are the fastest missiles that it is possible currently to imagine, and no anti-ballistic missile system can touch them. And they break into 5 separate warheads each, making 15 nuclear warheads, each one of them more than 1,000 times more powerful than the warheads dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So 3 missiles, 5 warheads, 15 nuclear bombs hitting the cities and strategic bases in the United Kingdom. It would bring the United Kingdom to a final end. 1,000 years of our island story would go up in nuclear smoke, would be burned in nuclear ash. And if you were lucky, you'd be killed in the blast. If you were unlucky, you'd be killed by the radiation. If you were more unlucky still, you'd be killed in the nuclear winter, which would envelop our whole island. It's as grim and as chilling a possibility, a prospect, as it's possible, at least for me, to imagine. But it isn't science fiction. What we saw last night in Dnipro was exactly what would happen to Britain times 15. Now, you may say Britain would fire off its own nuclear weapons, those that are working, and those that the Americans allowed us to launch. But that would be scant consolation, because we'd all be dead, including the people who pressed the buttons. The political leaders in the United Kingdom would presumably be in a nuclear bunker somewhere, but they'd have to emerge sometime. And when they emerged, they'd emerge to a nuclear winter. So scant consolation indeed. Others say that the United States would completely destroy Russia in retaliation for what Russia had just done to Britain. Others, even more foolishly, say that, well, France has nuclear weapons and it would not stand idly by while Britain was wiped off the face of the map. I want to challenge both of these assertions right now. I want to predict to you with some certainty that in the event of a European war turning nuclear, the United States would not sacrifice every city in the United States, would not sacrifice its entire country and all of its people to punish Russia for destroying Britain. If you thought that, you haven't fully calibrated the way in which the United States treats its allies. Ask the former leaders of South Vietnam. Ask the family of the deceased Shah of Persia, who was left wandering the world like a ghost, looking for somewhere to die when he ceased to be of use to the United States. Ask the erstwhile president of Afghanistan, if you can remember his name, who was promised that America was his best friend and ally, and for always. Ask anyone who's ever depended on the United States. The United States will make the decisions that it will make entirely in its own interest. And I hazard to guess that it would be ready to draw close, to declare an armistice with Russia, irrespective of what Russia had just done to Britain. Even more absurd is the idea that our European allies are our friends. For younger viewers, let me point this out. The European powers hate us. They've always hated us. They hated us for not folding like a cheap deck chair like they did in front of Hitler's advance in 1940. They hated us for continuing to fight the war into 1941 when they had all surrendered. They hated us when we arrived on the beaches at Normandy in 1944 to begin the task of liberating the western part of the European continent. They hated us for our attitude in the European Union for many a long year. They hated Mrs. Thatcher's no, 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 no attitude when we were members. They hate us for Brexit. The European Union is not prepared to sacrifice itself in retaliation for an attack by Russia on Britain. That's why I want people to contemplate this, that Britain has placed itself in a uniquely perilous, dangerous position. By acting as the tail of the American dog, Mad Dog Biden went in on the Monday, and Keir Starmer, being the tail of the Mad Dog, went in on the Tuesday. The tail always follows the dog, but the dog is more than ready to sacrifice its tail rather than sacrifice its head. Britain has placed itself in the first ranks of the hated so far as the Russian Federation is concerned. Now, I've spoken many times about this ancient and peculiar hatred that the British have for the Russians. It long predates the special military operation known by the rest of us as the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It long predates the presidency of Vladimir Putin. It even long predates the Russian Revolution. It goes back centuries to the imperial rivalry between this country and Russia. It's a peculiar and deep hatred which is now fully reciprocated. So if I'm any judge, if Russia is going to attack NATO in any shape or form, the target will be us, Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And whilst our criminal rulers will be deep underground, it will be the rest of us who will pay the price. It's about time we appraised ourselves of that. Not that we can depend upon the BBC, which has scarcely mentioned this crisis. In fact, the BBC didn't even mention the arrest warrants issued by the ICC today against Benjamin Netanyahu. It didn't make the news headlines on the BBC. So what's the chances of them appraising the British people of the nuclear peril in which they now stand? So if none of that sounds like an emergency to you, well, I don't know, frankly, what would. So No to NATO, No to War will this evening be discussing this matter with our panel. The first speaker of whom is a comrade of mine. Halima Khan is the former whistleblower of the crimes of the Starmer leadership, indeed crimes that were committed against the members of the Labour Party, even before Keir Starmer became the leader. She blew the whistle on the deliberate targeting of supporters of Palestine in the Labour Party for discipline and even expulsion. Since then, she's become a regular appearer on television. She's been a candidate for the Workers' Party of Britain. She's one of our brightest hopes. And she joins me now. Halima, what do you think? Let's start with Palestine, as that's your number one passion. What do you think of what was decided by the ICC today? And do you think Keir Starmer is going to arrest Netanyahu or Gallant or any of the other war criminals if they ever come here?
Absolutely not. I don't think so. Not at all. I mean, it was only days ago when the British ambassador to Tel Aviv announced that he's willing to put British personnel in the front lines and sacrifice their lives in order to protect Israel. So I highly doubt that, given Keir Starmer's history as head of the Crown Prosecution Service, he's protected other Israeli war criminals from arrest within that position. So absolutely not. I don't think that Starmer would be in any position to turn against his ally. He's a proud Zionist. His party is a party of Zionists, and they are, explicitly friends of Israel. So they would never turn on their friend, even if their friend turns on them.
First of all, I think the Netherlands was the very first country to say that Netanyahu will be arrested if he comes to the Netherlands. In one level, that's not surprising. The Hague, after all, is in the Netherlands. But on the other hand, the government of the Netherlands could scarcely be more Zionist, even if they were in Keir Starmer's cabinet. But they have the obligation as signatories to the ICC to carry out the arrest warrants that have now been finally issued. They've been a long time in coming. The French government followed quite swiftly in saying that it too would arrest, the German government also. So what we're looking at here is the European governments that signed the ICC protocol saying they will obey the court, but the British government so far unwilling to say that they would do the same. Now, I was brought up on the mantra that Britain was a law-abiding country. We even talked about the rules-based international order. The law is the law. Nobody is above the law. All of that bunkum was the mantra of the British state. But you're saying, and I agree with you, that it's highly unlikely that though members of the ICC, indeed founder members of the ICC, it's highly unlikely that we're going to do a damn thing about this.
Absolutely. I mean, Keir Starmer always pitches himself as a human rights lawyer, but he's a human rights liar. He's been caught out lying about everything. He doesn't stand for anything. When we talk about the havoc that he caused in the House of Commons on a ceasefire amendment, and that was on the call of, him calling up Isaac Herzog, the Israeli president, he was willing to actually destroy the foundation of our democracy. And that absolutely just went away like it was nothing. He never got held accountable. And this was when he was in opposition. So now he has control over every aspect of our lives and the military. And somebody like that, where he owes his career to Israel and the Zionist lobby, will absolutely sacrifice the rest of us for the people that he owes his career to.
Both he and David Lammy, the foreign secretary, recently denied that what's happening in Gaza is genocide. And they did so on the most extraordinary basis. Tell us about it.
Well, I think what they expect for their definition of a genocide is that Gaza has to be completely wiped out. And it is already completely wiped out. There's no semblance of life, or, the people in Palestine aren't really living, they're surviving. So, these things of, whatever the definition for genocide is for Britain, or even anti-Semitism, or even war crimes, has to be absolutely aligned with what Israel defines it. We live in the parameters of Israel's definition of war crimes and, genocide and even anti-Semitism. So when it comes to David Lammy's stance, and the British government stance is absolutely unsurprising to anybody that's been following the Labour Party for a number of years. And, the painful reality is that this didn't suddenly begin under Starmer. This also continued to happen under Corbyn. And I think that, one of the things that we as a society need to reconcile with is the fact that there is, fifth columns within every organized movement that actually help to advance the Zionist cause. And I think this is where we're not, even the oppositions that have, some sort of power in terms of organizing are still benefiting the cause of Zionism. So in terms of David Lammy's definition of genocide, I mean, these are the same hypocrites that were celebrating the ICC arrest warrant for Russia. Statistically, Israel has dropped 6 times the amount of bombs as the impact of Hiroshima, Dresden. All of these things go completely blighted by the amount of weaponry and the amount of attacks and civilian casualties and the war crimes that we are seeing day in, day out in Gaza. I think that, each one of those politicians are all standing there naked in their lies because people can see right through them. And I don't think that there's, even as time is going, I think people are waking up to the fact that we as a British society are becoming cannon fodder, and we are cannon fodder for states like Israel, for, big companies like BlackRock, like Raytheon, and all these companies that are funding all sides of every single war in the world. And just today, Keir Starmer was, celebrating the fact that he's been sat down with BlackRock and talking about investments. But what is that? Is that the farmlands? Because BlackRock has interests in taking the farmlands of Ukraine. Ukraine is, seen as the, biggest farmlands, biggest agricultural farmlands that feed Europe. But BlackRock have a vested interest. It was only in September where Raytheon was fined £200 million. It was only in September or this summer, where Raytheon was fined £200 million for, they're obviously Raytheon is a weapons manufacturing company that's, funding Ukraine, but they were fined for sending military information to China, Russia, and Iran as well. To a company like Raytheon, where the biggest shareholders are BlackRock, that's pocket change to them. These fines are meaningless. They are still continuing to operate, and it's all because these wars need to absolutely continue for these large companies like BlackRock to steal all agricultural land and have absolute control over our food as well as every other aspect in life. So these wars are absolutely necessary components. And I think the other thing that, being a whistleblower, I do tend to go out and seek and hunt for whistleblowers, knowing that, we are the people that will never get platformed. We would be shunned down, and anything that we have to say, the powers that be will make it hell and make sure it never goes out. Where we're talking about nuclear wars, there was a whistleblower from Raytheon called Eric Hecker. Many people don't know of him, but he has submitted dossiers to Congress and American intelligence about the weapons that he saw were being manufactured in the South Pole. So he worked in the South Pole in 2010, and what he whistleblew on was the fact that Raytheon has weapons capable of producing earthquakes. So where these things were called crazy conspiracy theories, we are now finding out for it to be absolutely true. So where Raytheon is funding and arming every single part of every single war, you have to then think, have we seen an increase of other kinds of phenomena? And is it really all linked to climate change, or is there something even more evil and sinister, such as weapons that are actually being built that humans don't have the capacity to wrap their head around?
Well, thought-provoking indeed. Finally, before we leave Labour, where you once toiled and did your best until you couldn't stomach it anymore, it's worth making the point that both David Lammy and Keir Starmer have previously described as genocide conflicts infinitely smaller than the one in Gaza. Keir Starmer actually was the legal representative before the ICJ in a case brought by a very small number of Croatian people, in which he argued that the people of Croatia had suffered genocide. David Lammy accuses the Chinese government of genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province, even while acknowledging that not a single one of them has been killed. He has defined genocide as cultural genocide. So China is guilty of genocide against Uyghurs, though it has killed none of them. The Serbs were guilty of genocide in Croatia, though it killed few of them. But Israel is not guilty of genocide, though it has killed and maimed, mutilated, amputated hundreds of thousands of people in a population of 2 million. You must be glad you're out of such a party now, Halima.
Well, I mean, when I was asked, I was never, somebody who was a member of the Labour Party. I spent most of my life apolitical because I grew up going from just a regular Asian girl that got targeted for the color of my skin to being targeted because I'm a Muslim because of Tony Blair. And that was in my childhood. So from a child, I was heavily traumatized by Tony Blair and how one individual impacted my entire life. So when I actually went into the Labour Party, in my interview, when they asked me if I was a Labour member, I said, I'm only here because I don't believe in Corbyn, not necessarily because I believe in Corbyn, but I fear that there's going to be another Tony Blair. So when Keir Starmer came in, it was blatantly obvious that it was Blairism returning and taking over. So for me, of course, I'm glad to no longer be associated with them, but I'm also grateful to have had that opportunity to actually have confirmation of all of the fears or disgust or hatred that I had for an organization like the Labour Party, and how in its core it is a warmongering party.
So how can people follow you, Halima? How can they support your work? I'm sure many watching this would like to do so.
Thank you. You can follow me on X at Halima Naomi, Nyomi. And it's the same one across all my social media platforms.
Excellent. Thanks for being with us on No2Nato, No to War this evening. My next guest is a man who's got up early for this broadcast today. That's because he's down under, as we like to say, we Eurocentrists like to say. He's in Australia. As a matter of fact, he's a special resident of Australia. He lives in the Russian consulate in Canberra because the Australian authorities were unable to cope with the sheer power and intellect of his anti-war work. He's known to you probably as the Aussie Cossack, and we're struggling now, fighting now, to get him back on Twitter. But his real name is Simeon Boykov. And I'd like to wish you a good morning, Simeon. I wished you good night last night when you were on the mother of all talk shows. Good to see you again so quickly, but quite a lot has happened since we last talked last night. Russia has answered NATO. What do you think of the answer so far?
Well, it's been a very long night watching the situation play out. Probably one of the most important events to this date. I can't recall at any time in history where a country has used these type of ballistic missiles in an offensive capacity. I think it's the first time, really. the Americans are saying they're intermediate missiles, so they're not intercontinental. But I think it's very clear that these are nuclear-capable missiles, which were not carrying nuclear warheads. So as devastating as and effective as the strike was, it still is another shot across the bow. It still is another warning shot that Russia has performed. And the weapons that were used, it was just amazing. Some people were saying it's like a UFO. They've never seen this type of weapons. Flashes in the sky and then like bolts of energy or light hitting the ground. Quite impressive. And nobody, as you mentioned earlier, can shoot them down. Russia has demonstrated this. And it just shows that all this time Russia has had these weapons and they've had the self-control not to deploy them, not to use them. And what Putin has been saying all along was not a bluff. It was being very serious and very accurate and very honest in his rhetoric, responding to the West's use of Storm Shadow missiles and Taurus missiles and ATACMS missiles and HIMARS missiles. With Vladimir Putin, you can see he's angry. And I hate to say this, but he's aged a little bit because he's holding a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. He has the option to go to war, to full war, to nuclear war. He has the option. His missiles, as we can see, can reach anywhere in Europe, anywhere on the continent, and even other continents in a matter of minutes. But he has had the self-control to withstand all of the sanctions. He's had the self-control and the resilience to fight a collective horde of 55 countries. And of course, this is thanks to the blood of Russian soldiers who are honorably fighting and dying, defending Russia, but also choosing a conventional method of warfare to avoid using the nuclear option. And I hope, George, that Western leaders will understand that this is no longer a bluff. Russians do not bluff. Putin has never bluffed. When he says something, he does it. And it's another example. And Putin is saying, back off. Don't use missiles against us. Don't give your NATO missiles and pretend that they are being used by Ukrainians, because they're not being used by Ukrainians. NATO missiles, British missiles, US missiles, French missiles, German missiles, which are launched at Russian territory, are used by instructors of those countries. So it's false to claim that that's Ukraine doing that. It's not Ukraine. At the same time, the particular plant, the factory, the strategic target of the strike last night was a Soviet-era huge weapons factory. Yuzhmash, it was called previously, under the Soviet Union. It's one of the leading weapons factories. So Russia can take out these strategic factories, whatever's left of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Again, thanks to the Soviet Union, who Ukraine criticizes so much, but is able to reap the benefits of everything the Soviet Union left behind. Vladimir Putin will continue using these missiles and deploying them. But the question is, will the warheads be conventional or will they carry something stronger? Because it is a bit of an overkill. It is quite expensive to use these type of missiles. And Russia has hundreds of them. That's the good news for Russia. They've got plenty of them, and they're making more, and they're updating their missile fleet. Yes, maybe Russia falls behind in some type of manufacturing or commercial goods, or maybe cars or things like that, as that was the case in the Soviet Union. But they certainly are leading the world in missile production and missile technology. And the West understands that. Today, the Pentagon spokesperson in Washington confirmed, reiterated that the US does not seek war with Russia. Well, if the US does not seek war with Russia, back off. Stop supplying weapons to Russia's enemies. Stop making, more importantly, an enemy out of a neighbor. The territory of Ukraine was always the territory of Russia, always part of the Russian Empire, always part of the Soviet Union. And Russia was happy to see Ukraine flourish. Ukraine, in its short time of existence since 1991, was heavily subsidized by Russian gas, Russian energy, and Russia really does not need any more land or anything else. And there's no desire to conquer, or there's no imperialistic desire, or even though there is a bit of nostalgia to bring back the borders of the Russian Empire of the Soviet Union, which I admit that I share also, because I simply don't think that it's appropriate for NATO to be so close to Russia's borders, and they can't be trusted. Russia tried to trust them. Russia tried to do the right thing. Russia followed the advice of the Western advisors under the traitor Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and look what happens. They set up NATO bioweapons factories, laboratories, bases, instructors, missiles, anti-aircraft, batteries, Patriot systems. So Russia is fighting a righteous special military operation, and this is a great uplift in spirit for everybody watching. I think we can all agree, whether you're Russian or not Russian, or at least you're pro-Russian or you're neutral, it's a great thing. Let's just say this on the air. It's a beautiful thing to see those Russian missiles fall from the sky in a shocking move, shocking new technology, which the world has not seen. Literally, commentators are saying, what is it? Is it a UFO? What are they using? How are they using these weapons? No one's seen this before. And it's a great thing, because some people in the West thought that Russia was weak. They thought Russia didn't have the capacity, that Russia is fighting a conventional war because they don't have these very powerful weapons, which they have just demonstrated. So it's a great thing, isn't it? It's a good thing to celebrate, to remind everybody.
Well, most of us, of course, I hear what you say. I'm not a pacifist myself, but I nonetheless hate war. And I know all about weapons, but I hate to see them used. And most of us are hoping for a negotiated end to this conflict, because some of us love Russia. I'm one of them, but neither do we hate Ukraine. And we will never hate Ukrainians because they're Ukrainians. The Ukrainians made a great contribution to Soviet life and to the defeat of Nazism in the Second World War, both as soldiers, but also as partisans. You and I talked about the desecration of the memorial of one of those in Odessa, of all places, yesterday. Yes, Tanya. The real reason, isn't it, why Biden has done this, not just this, but the decision on landmines also, in breach of their own law and their own international treaty commitments. They've decided to spread landmines around the battlefield. The reason he's done this is because Donald Trump will be along in a minute, and he's committed to ending this war. That's my analysis. Is it yours?
Certainly, this is a very dishonest move by the Biden administration to try to set Trump up in a very difficult situation. And I think the Russians understand this. I think Vladimir Putin understands this. The Russian government understands that the Biden administration in its final dying days, and Kamala, clearly she's very upset. Hillary Clinton, very upset. Jessica Newland, very upset. I mean, they can't believe they lost. They invested billions and billions of dollars into this election. They bribed well-known sports figures, celebrities, Hollywood singers, all sorts of influencers to try to win the election, and they failed. They spent billions on this, and they failed. They had the backing of the establishment. They had the backing of all of the US mainstream media. They had the backing of US corporations, huge billion-dollar companies backed Kamala's campaign, and they still lost. They clearly are not happy, and this is their way, I believe, of trying to put Trump in a very dangerous and peculiar situation. But it just shows how sick in the head they are. They're playing with fire. They're not worried about sending the world to World War III. They're not worried about putting America, the American people, their own constituents, in danger, at risk. Because if the missiles start flying, as you have reminded us, George, on numerous occasions, no one will be safe. Or perhaps somebody in the middle of Australia, maybe in the Northern Territory or somewhere in Western Australia, might get away with hiding under a rock. But really, and even then they won't be safe, because the US has bases in Australia, foolishly. I mean, the Australian government foolishly has allowed US, the military, to put the long-range bombers here, which of course makes then Australia a target in the event of a big war. And speaking of these countries becoming targets, the Russian government reiterated today that any country supplying weapons, especially these long-range missiles, to Ukraine will be a target. Because if the missiles start flying, there is a protocol, there is a military doctrine. So the Russians would break open a safe and they would pull out the doctrine under a wax seal, and they would say, okay, step 1, insert keys. Step 2, get the password from the Kremlin. Step 3, get approval from the president. Step 4, enter target destinations. And the doctrine says you must take out all the targets, all of the NATO countries, all of the enemies who are attacking Russia and threatening Russia. And that is the capability that Russia has. And Russia needs to be respected. And that's why if Russia wants to conduct business on her borders, or in her backyard, or in her front yard, or in territories which were formerly belonging to Russia, fairly and squarely, which Russia sort of waived its rights to in 1991 on the in an act of goodwill, Russia has every right to conduct its business on its borders and neutralize threats and demilitarize Nazis and denazify Nazis. That's what happened to Ukraine, unfortunately. And you're completely correct by saying that we don't have any animosity towards the Ukrainians. And I've said it many times myself, that the only real country, the only real people who care about Ukraine, it's not Zelensky. He hates Ukrainians. Zelensky is killing Ukrainians. He's genociding Ukrainians. It's Russia who actually cares about Ukrainians. Look at Vladimir Putin today, saying that if we ever use these missiles again, these Oreshkin missiles, and the word Oreshkin is basically means nutcracker. It's a very appropriate name of these missiles. He said that if we ever use them again, we will warn the other side. We will give you 30 minutes warning, or we'll give you advance warning so you can evacuate civilians. What kind of a country does that? I mean, does Israel do that? Do they say to the Palestinians, I'll evacuate this area because we're going to bomb it? Maybe they have in the past, according to CNN, but Russia is very serious about that. Russia don't want to see any Ukrainians die at all, which is why so many Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering to the Russian military. And they've got much higher chances of living, these Ukrainians, when they surrender to Russia than they do in their own military, the Ukrainian military. So Russia is conducting an honorable special operation. Now Russia has an opportunity, hopefully, to see a different reaction from the West. This is a demonstration of force, a demonstration of power, and I think it's working. I think it's working. I think people are getting the message now, because I can even feel, George, I can feel a uplift of spirit of amongst the pro-Russians, where people who are pro-Russian. I was speaking to people in Russia in the last 6 to 7 hours before the show during all of these events, and people are happy. People are pleased. Russians are saying, excellent. Good that we're demonstrating those weapons, those missiles, because that's the only language it seems that NATO understands. Unfortunately, they don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand reasonable discussion. They only understand force.
Well, the current administration is certainly not going to be involved in any diplomacy, but there is speculation this evening, Simeon, that behind the scenes, the incoming administration are doing so. That Donald Trump and Elon Musk, the man I'm suing and the man who put you off Twitter, that these two men are involved in behind the scenes discussion with the Russian government. Can you help us with that? Any intelligence come your way on that?
Well, look, I'm aware that you are suing Elon. He incorrectly inferred that you are a Russian TV state broadcaster. I wish you the best of luck. And I note that you've put forward in your demands to Elon to settle that case of defamation against you by Elon Musk and his platform, you've put the demand to restore my X account, which I am greatly appreciative for, George. I really do appreciate that you're sticking your neck out to help your comrade in Australia, the Aussie Cossack. It's quite remarkable. Look, I was suspended on X. For what reason? I was accused of campaigning against Kamala Harris and campaigning in support of Trump and campaigning in support of Elon Musk. So I don't know what strategy Elon is employing by suspending his sort of key staunch supporters in other parts of the globe. Hopefully, Elon gets the message and restores. There's quite a few pro-Russian accounts which were taken down and suspended on X in the days before the election on Twitter, and I have hope in Elon that he will restore them. But speaking of Elon Musk, let's face it, Elon Musk is a very, very powerful individual. He's grown very quickly to a very powerful position, and with the incoming Trump administration, Elon will wield unimaginable power. One person has the power over basically, I would say, probably more than 50% of the world's information exchange when it comes to social media and X. He's in control. Right? He's in control of the algorithm. He's in control of the code. Very, very powerful man. He's in control of satellites. He has the power to just turn off and turn on people's cars, people's devices, people's GPS. When countries are reliant on him as one person, he's one person who is a private individual. For example, take Ukraine. Ukraine is completely reliant on Starlink. Many other countries reliant on Starlink. If Elon turned off Starlink when the Ukrainians wanted to attack Crimea, in a very interesting pro-Russian move that Elon made. Elon is the only person, the one person who's an individual and not a government and not a country, who sends up satellites into space using missiles which are probably very similar in their characteristics to the same type of missiles that would be used in a nuclear war. It would only take in a few weeks or a few days, really, of Elon's brilliant organizational abilities and entrepreneurial skills to, if he wanted to, if he needed to convert his civilian use missile fleet into a military application. And that needs to be considered. And now he is becoming Trump's right-hand man. I mean, Trump he's aged, just as Putin has aged, just as they've been around for a while. Trump and Putin, these guys have been in the game for a while. And you can see Trump, he's not a spring chicken anymore. He's not as young as and youthful and energetic and enthusiastic. And the campaign took it out of him. You could see campaigning every day. But he won, and he's going to need to hand over power, to offload tasks. I mean, Trump wants to be Trump. He wants to appear as a billionaire with his beautiful wife and enjoy the presidency as Trump and make great speeches and so forth. But Elon Musk, on the other hand, he's a person who wants to get his hands dirty, and he wants to get into the game of controlling America, controlling Americans, but not only America, the world, controlling the world. Countries like Australia completely reliant on America. So keep an eye on Elon Musk. And what can I say without criticizing Elon Musk too much? Because we know that he's the one who holds the switch, the button, when it comes to social media. I mean, George, I have to take an example probably from you. You're suing him and you criticize him, and you're still on his platforms, and clearly Elon isn't comfortable with suspending you, and he tolerates the fact that he's got a major world broadcaster. I would say you're one of the top 3 or top 4, top 5 broadcasters on the planet. So he can't take you down, George, even though you're suing him. It's quite a remarkable position. So keep an eye on Elon Musk. We praise him. We say he gave us free speech. But who knows what happens when one person has too much power? Just to put that thought out.
I think I concur with everything that you said there. And I think he saved America. He therefore potentially saved the world, because we were headed into a one-party state in the United States, of liberal warmongers forever. If Musk had not overthrown the previous regime that owned Twitter, which, as you say, is easily the most dominant source of news in the world by a country mile, both in quantity and in quality. If he had not opened that up to freedom of speech for some and an end to the conspiracy between the deep state in the United States and Twitter, then they would have had all the cards in their hand. They've got Zuckerberg, they've got Instagram, they've got Facebook, they've got Zuckerberg, they've got Bezos, they've got the New York Times, they've got the liberal broadcast media in America. They would have had it all, and they would have ensured that Kamala Harris had won the presidential election. Matter of fact, if it wasn't for Musk and the coup, I'll call it, that he performed in taking control of Twitter, Trump might not be alive today. He certainly might not be at liberty today, and he certainly wouldn't have been in the White House today. And given that Trump is going to stop the war between the United States and Russia, you could argue, therefore, that the entire thing turned on Elon Musk. So I hope he makes his peace with you, and if I can help that, I definitely will. But finally, Simeon, the hoary old myth continues to be used here about the North Korean hordes that have poured into the Russian line. Nobody's seen a North Korean. Nobody's got a picture of a North Korean. Nobody's got a trace of a North Korean. And in any case, there would be nothing wrong with North Koreans being in the Russian line, but they're not. These lies that they tell and repeat often enough so that people believe them have bedeviled this whole story, haven't they? People think this started in 2022, when you and I both know it started in 2014. It started before that, started in the 50s, when the CIA were recruiting the Bandera Nazi fifth column, the people who carried out the mass murder at Babi Yar and elsewhere, the people who helped the Einsatzgruppen massacre the Poles, massacre the Jews, massacre the partisans, the Russians, the Ukrainians. We know all that, but most people still believe this all began on a big lie that Vladimir Putin woke up one morning with a sore head in 2022 and decided to invade Ukraine. Last words to you, Simeon.
Look, unfortunately, Putin did not invade Ukraine when he should have. And now, I never criticize Vladimir Putin. Really, I can't recall many times I've criticized him ever in my life. It's not in our sort of culture to criticize the leader. We love our president. And in the US, they bag the president. In Australia, they bag the prime minister. In Russia, people love their leader. But one thing which patriots like myself criticized Vladimir Putin for was that he was too patient. He had too much self-control, and he was too kind and trusting of the West. And he should have just gone for it in 2014. As soon as the Crimea situation occurred, as soon as the Maidan occurred in Kiev and the legitimately, democratically elected government of Ukraine, a pro-Russian leaning government, was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup, Putin did the right thing by taking Crimea. But we think he should have kept going. And that was the only criticism, that Putin was too patient and he was too trusting of the West. And you know what, to be quite honest, Putin later, he was later on, already well into the special operation, Putin admitted that himself. He said, we'll never make that mistake again. We will never believe the West again. And that was very good to see. Because look, so many Ukrainian cities and regions were just waiting for Russia to enter. Places like Slavyansk, places like Odessa, the city of Odessa, it's a Russian city, for goodness sake. People speak Russian there. The city of Kharkov, it's a Russian city. It was always a Russian city. The people were waiting there. In 2014, they raised the Russian flag on the administration. They had huge protests, pro-Russian protests in Odessa everywhere, and we know what the Nazis did on the 2nd of May 2014. They burned people alive. It was very terrible to see. And now it's spiraled out of control, and Russia is fighting the Ukrainian army, which for the last 8 years since the Minsk agreements was trained, armed, and bolstered. So this whole time when they said we want a ceasefire, and they convinced Putin to stop and not go further than Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea, they fooled the Russians. They tricked the Russians, and Russia admits that now, because for then 8 years they pumped Ukraine with money and instructors and weapons, and prepared the Ukrainian army and created a NATO army. This is really, if we look at the Cold War, this is the Cold War. This is the apex of the Cold War. This is what that was. Everything was building up to in terms of the technical characteristics, in terms of the weapons that are being used, because all the weapon stocks that were built up over the last 50, 60 years in Europe were in storage. They were never used, really, ever. And here they are all being used, including the Western weapons, including the Bradleys, the Abrams, the Leopard tanks, the Challenger tanks, all the weapons, including also all the Soviet weapons. That's the real tragedy of it, is that the Soviet weapons, which the Soviet Union built up all those years and gave to Ukraine and gave to countries like Greece, with the Greek government, very terrible decision, handed over all of the former Soviet weapons, East German weapons, Romania, Hungary, all these countries who, Poles, the Polish nation received so much help as a Warsaw Pact member and so many free weapons from the Soviets. And it's a tragedy to see that all those weapons being used by Ukrainians to kill Russians, to kill Russian civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk. That's why you cannot trust the West. You cannot trust NATO. And they've been waiting for this day, and they've got this moment. And that's why this war this special operation is a very epic war of our time, because it's built up to this. And look, what can I say? The Russians are handling it well. They are doing a great job defending their interests. And in closing, thank you to everybody around the world, in the Western world, who understands this, who has got it right, and they're on the right side of history, who went against the mainstream media's advice, went against the current thing, and said, no, Russia is not our enemy. NATO is the person or the organization who is in the wrong here, is the aggressor. And again, in closing, hopefully Elon, Putin, Trump sit down, they sort it out, and let's get the planet back to normal. Let's start trading again. Let's start making money. Let's start pushing down debt, American debt. Let's start being friends. The Russian soldier, the Russian man is not your enemy. Your enemy is in the deep state. Your enemy is in your parliament, and they're not Russians.
Indeed. Simeon Boykov, as always, absolute delight to talk with you. Thanks for appearing again this evening on No to NATO, No to War. Thanks to Halima Khan. Kit Klarenberg would appear not to have been able to be with us. Our apologies if you were waiting for him. I was myself very keen to hear him. Perhaps we'll have him on the next broadcast. My postscript, if you like, is mainly to ask you to help us raise the price of appointing a full-time organizer for No to NATO, No to War. It's a very modest target that we have. £20,000 will get us a full-time organizer to improve and extend and spread the message that we are against NATO, we are against war, and we believe that NATO is the key to stopping the wars. It certainly won't happen in the British Parliament. Not only was the British Parliament not asked if it wanted British weapons to be fired into Russia. It wasn't even told, and not a murmur was raised in the British Parliament against it yesterday. Today, unease began to grow a little, and we hope that this broadcast and our work will help spread the message that we don't want war with Russia, and we don't regard Russia as our enemy. If you agree with us, follow us. Join No to NATO, No to War. Make a donation to the QR code on the corner of the screen now, and come back next time we call a No to NATO, No to War meeting. Thank you and good night.